I want to, without further ado, introduce Jonathan Voss, who is the moderator, who's the moderator of this panel, and also is a VP at Lake Research Partners. He's a focus group moderator, so I'll hand it over to him.
To our panelists. So you've heard from David. At the end, we have Soledad Mills. She's the CEO of Equitable Origin. She's going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the performance standards that they have created. And we have Dalal, VP of Social Enterprise Innovation at FINCA International, talking a little bit of the applications of microfinance in terms of renewable energy adoption. So, let me start with you and just give a little bit of overview about your
work.
About your work.
Sure. So I'm going to start with somebody else's story. It's a story that Melinda Gates actually tells about some time that she and her daughter spent in a rural village in Africa that didn't have electricity. So she took her daughter down to this village. They spent, I think, about a month there. And at the end of that month, Melinda asked the little girl whose home they were staying at, of all of the things of Melinda's daughter that this little girl could want or take, what would she want? And she said that she wanted the little headlamp that Melinda's daughter wore because it would enable her to study at night. And that story, I think about that story all the time, possibly because I'm a girl, possibly because I'm also the daughter of immigrants. So I also think about, but for the grace of God. But it is it's that impetus that drives the new generation of work that FINCA International is undertaking. And I'll come back to that story in a minute. So by 2050, I think we have to hit some pretty aggressive emission reduction targets. By 2050, half of the new population growth that will happen in the world will happen in Africa, adding approximately 1.3 billion people. Today, there's 1.2 billion people that don't have access to energy. Half of those people live in Africa. Even with all of the investment in the world, I'm speaking in hyperbole, the grid will not keep up with the population development. And so therein lies a challenge. The other piece of this puzzle is that a predominant number of these folks actually live for less than $5 a day. Buying fuel, such as kerosene, can cost up to 30% of their scarce income. And coming back to Melinda Gates' story, so why is this little girl actually spending or needing a headlamp to do work at nighttime? She comes home from school at 3 o'clock. Why can't she spend the daylight hours to do her homework? It's because girls and women spend 5 times as much time on unproductive or non-income generating or unproductive labor. So when that little girl comes home, she goes and has to go collect firewood. She has to help mom with the cooking. And so while her brother actually gets to come home and start his homework, she has to help mom until everything is done. And then she maybe, if the family has the money to budget for a little extra bit of kerosene, she'll study with that light. We need clean energy. We need affordable energy. And from where I sit, energy is power. In fact, for women, it's a superpower because it unlocks productive capacity. And from where we sit at FINCA, it can help fight poverty in a transformational way. So then, and that's where FINCA comes in. I didn't actually start this conversation by telling you about what FINCA is, but what FINCA started about 35 years ago with the premise that access to finance can unlock productive capacity. Today, we operate across 20 countries throughout the world, serving 2 million clients with small loans that can help them purchase products or raw materials or inputs to then either make products with or working capital to buy agriculture and sell in the market the next day. In doing this, we actually work in incredibly rural and underserved markets where we've actually built trust networks, distribution networks, and we provide access to finance. And so our goal is how do we build these how do we use these trust networks that we've built along with access to finance to enable people to access meaningful quantities of distributed clean energy solutions. Actually, may just end it there, and then we can talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Soledad.
Thank you, and thanks to Chip for inviting me here. It's an honor to share the stage with such distinguished panelists, and everyone here is doing incredible and amazing work. It's inspiring to be here this week. So thank you to all of you. Equitable Origin is a nonprofit that partners with communities, government, and business to support transparent, sustainable, and equitable development of energy that benefits all stakeholders. We are based in New York, but we were originally founded in Latin America in 2009. And the vision of the founders was really to transform the way energy has been developed in the past. They saw firsthand some of the negative impacts that have occurred as a result of traditional and fossil fuel development, and really wanted to create a model, a market-based mechanism that would recognize and reward and incentivize best social and environmental practices to reduce negative impacts on local communities. So as investment grows in renewables, it has sparked conflicts over land and resources. And I'll give 3 very quick case studies, which if anyone wants more detail can go into in the Q&A. But one example is in Oaxaca, Mexico. There was a project that took place a few years ago that was a 396 megawatt wind farm developed by a European company that went into the communities without proper consultation and law, because in that area, 75% of the land is under a social property model. And so by law, there are certain free, prior, and informed consent processes that companies need to follow. So the communities took that wind farm to court and won an injunction, a permanent injunction against it. And so, and that was an $89 million project that was essentially canceled. Similarly, in Kenya, there was a 60 megawatt wind farm that had $150 million in investment that was canceled due to protests and conflicts over land that resulted in one person being shot dead in the protests. And this was because of local farmers not being able to access their traditional lands because of the company's essentially land grabbing. Also, there's another very high-profile wind farm, the largest wind farm in Africa, in Lake Turkana, which is in northern Kenya. That is a 310 megawatt project, and the communities there have also taken that company to court due to allegations that they acquired ancestral community land without proper prior consultation, as well as a whole host of other socioeconomic impacts that project is having. And then lastly, in Liberia in 2013, a biomass power plant actually essentially went bankrupt after a few years, but not after it had resulted in higher costs of local subsistence resource commodities for indigenous peoples, and that project had a $200 million investment from OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and communities took a formal complaint to OPIC about the human rights impacts of that project. So those are just a few examples, and that's not to say that many other projects go forward without these issues, but as countries rush to meet the clean energy goals under the Paris Agreement, except for the US, that can result in slowdowns in getting renewable energy online. If you don't have the social license to operate, if you don't have the buy-in of local communities, it's going to take longer for these projects to get off the ground, and that creates potential losses for investors as well. So we really want to promote responsible energy development that's done in a way that protects the rights of local communities and creates benefits for them so they're not left worse off than they were before the project. A recent study by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center found that 90% of wind and hydropower companies surveyed didn't have a specific policy on indigenous people's rights or free, prior, and informed consent. 65% of the world's land is under community ownership or indigenous people's ownership, but only 18% of that ownership is formally recognized by governments. So as these renewable energy projects, which require huge swaths of land, much larger areas than conventional energy development, actually oil and gas footprints have been shrinking as technology has advanced. There's horizontal drilling, pads are much smaller these days, whereas wind farms need an average of 60 acres per megawatt in order to have enough space, and turbines are getting bigger so that they can be more efficient. We're going to definitely see increasing conflicts between communities and companies over land resources, and therefore we all want renewable energy to scale as quickly as possible, so we need to find a way to do it that will gain not only the support of local communities, but ultimately so that energy development is driven by local communities, and that's the only way it can be sustainable and we can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past 150 years of development. Thank you.
So we were talking this morning a little bit about some of the barriers for adoption of your various models, and I was struck by the presentation earlier talking about how true leadership is that follower who follows that first crazy person. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the on-ramp to adoption that each of you have faced in the new models that you're embarking on?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
David,
it is always that heretic, right? Mm-hmm. And with us as well, that's where we're proud of the Shell Oil relationship. We know that they just finished filming a documentary and they're about to launch a product category in the United Kingdom and in Holland. And that we know will be the beginning of movement where others will then follow. Mm-hmm. And so we've invested a tremendous amount of time and energy in that, knowing that will be a tipping point. So for us, of course, critically important. I think it's a business principle, a life principle as well, and a part of the way that we recognize we need to implement. And of course, there may be other ways as well, mm-hmm. but it's what we've been doing. Okay.
I mean, you were talking a little bit about the challenge of kind of almost a generational challenge of people who don't necessarily have access to energy and how that kind of paradigm shift works.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see changemakers at two levels, right? One is around the kinds of folks that we partner with to deliver these solutions. And so we're working right now with one of the largest energy hardware manufacturers who really see the potential and the importance of solar energy in what we call BOP, or basic pyramid markets. And the two of us have invested in an early stage solar company that has sort of just refined the panel plus the lights and a fan or some kind of productive use asset to create a income out of to sort of 1/3 the cost of what's in the market today. So we provide the feedback from the customer and say, look, customers, they want TVs, but they actually just want things that they can actually earn more income off of. And the hardware company comes in and says, well, you know what, we've got all of these facilities, we can help test the battery, we can do all of these things. And so it's been so refreshing to work with these company like this that is that operates in the worlds of billions and trillions, but is willing to sort of be on, work with us and make a small investment in a company that can be really transformative at what we call the BOP. In terms of a change maker at the community level, I mean, that is how we, marketing doesn't work in markets that are broken. And so we go into markets and we work with our customers from the microfinance side and explain the products, explain how it works. And a few raise their hand and say, yeah, I've got a cousin in Kampala that's used something like this. I'm happy to give it a go. And they bring it back to the village and they light up their house. Their friends start coming to them to say, hey, can I charge my cell phone? The church says, look, we're doing an evening prayer service. Do you mind if we borrow this? All of a sudden, this person's status in the community is kind of elevated. He's a problem solver. And so other folks kind of raise their hand and say, I want this kind of product. And so it's a long game, right, in these markets in many ways. But that's, but we acknowledge that, and which is why, we operate the way we do as a 501c3 and all of those things.
Yeah, that's a great question. In renewables, we're seeing a kind of learning curve as these issues are beginning to emerge. These case studies are coming up. These surveys and reports are coming out. There's increasing NGO attention on these issues. So there have been some activism and advocacy around this. So we're still in the very early stages with the sector. It's a relatively new sector. So there's a desire for guidance and tools for managing these impacts, identifying them and managing them. We're not at the stage where there's interest in normative frameworks and standards yet, but that's the typical curve that we've seen in other industries like extractives. So it's ironic, but extractives companies have massive departments dedicated to community relations, community outreach, community consultation, engagement, social and environmental impact assessment, massive teams of people. Renewable companies, we haven't seen that happen yet, but it will probably follow that same curve.
What are some of the partnerships that you can foresee in the near and the long term that would kind of help you, each of you in the work that you do, kind of overcome some of the challenges that you face?
I think life is all about partnership. It's all about the synergy when 1 and 1 makes 10 or 50. We continue, and as the value of the organization is to gather together. It's really to gather together with the entire world and to create that conduit. And I think that any organization that embarks has to be embarking on an organization that is there to partner. It's not one man's responsibility to make change in the world, but to be the shepherd of those that want to make change in the world.
Yeah, from our side, I mean, I spent the last 2 days learning a lot more about sort of the energy challenges or the renewable energy challenges in the United States. For a long time, I was always looking towards the BOP markets in my work, and so I was like, we've got it figured out here. Like, we'll be fine. And I learned so much about the challenges in the United States and how important partnerships within and across states and stakeholders are. We operate in markets where the things that we take for granted in terms of the infrastructure, social as well as physical, just don't exist. And so I appreciate that in the United States, we're solving challenging problems. Operating in the markets we do, it's really hairy. And so without partnership, there's no way for us to do it on our own. And the way we think about it is just around core competencies. We know what we bring to the table, and we look for folks that bring other things. And we operate in a world of such resource scarcity that we try not to recreate any kind of the wheel in any kind of way. And so we know we're good at end user financing. Sometimes we have strong distribution. In some markets where we're not as densely penetrated, we look for folks that are really good at distribution of health goods and other things, and see how we can bring our credit capabilities to work with them. We're certainly not going to be innovating any of the essential service products that we want to provide to our customer. I know, compared to everyone in this room, very little about renewable energy other than the problem it solves for my customer. And so I'm looking for, solutions that work for folks that make less than $5 a day. And so it's incumbent on our success, that we find smart partnerships.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. I think as small, resource-constrained, nonprofit organizations, we absolutely need to partner. We don't want to reinvent the wheel at all. There's no time for reinventing the wheel. We do almost all of our work through partnerships, whether it's academic partnerships, government partnerships, partnering with companies, partnering with communities and community organizations. So it's fundamental to the work we do, and we couldn't do it without them.
I wanted to give folks in the audience an opportunity for Q&A. We have plenty of time for that, so I'll open it up for some questions. Right here in the front.
Yes, this one's for Soledad. First of all, I think perhaps there was a confusion in one of the things you mentioned, that you said that the wind energy took 60 acres for 1 megawatt. I think it'd be more characteristic of the solar. Wind would the other way around. It would be about 1 acre for 2 or 3 megawatts today. But that's not, aside from that, it kind of surprises me when you say that the renewable energy industry has not done their homework in terms of community relations. And obviously, I defer to your expertise because you obviously have a broad compass. But I can say, speaking for our own company, and for the companies that we know, I mean, Oak Creek Energy, we're working in Mexico right now, and we absolutely take enormous pains to assure that we have everybody who has any interest in the land thoroughly engaged legally and equitably, and that we are also extending benefits to the communities so that they understand that we are there to improve their situation rather than to exploit them. And the question that I would ask you is, I don't quite understand how the indigenous communities would not be benefiting by the revenues that would accrue from the project. Maybe you can elaborate on that. I mean, I'm aware of what happened in Mexico. I was not particularly directly aware of what happened with the two instances that you mentioned in Africa. But can you elaborate on that point?
Sure,
if you have more
absolutely.
information.
Firstly, thank you for correcting my numbers there. Those may have been out of date. But it's companies like yours that we really want to recognize and hold up as examples of good practice, because it's not happening across the whole sector. And there needs to be more sharing of information from companies like yours that are going in and doing the right practices. And so that's where our model comes in. It's to recognize and call out companies that are doing things right. And they serve as models for the rest of the sector. So it would be great to discuss how we could do that. In terms of your question about indigenous peoples, there have been books written about this. I don't think we have time to go into details here, but I will sum it up with a concept called the resource curse, which has been written mostly about in relation to mining and oil and gas, but where the actual projects are developed in local communities. Much of that revenue goes to the central government, and it doesn't trickle back down to the most affected people who are living with the day-to-day impacts of the projects. And so that's where there's a big mismatch. So there are some interesting models around community ownership and distributing shares in the project to the local community so they do get some direct benefit. But in many countries, especially emerging markets, there isn't a strong enough or robust enough structure, and there's a lot of corruption too about getting those revenues or portions of them back to the most affected areas.
Hello. So several folks have touched on this the last couple of days, but I'm wondering if you all can talk about the role that investors might play in ensuring that we can have best practices on energy development and reducing other impacts.
I can start there. So investors can play a role through their due diligence processes. Mainstream investors are increasingly taking into account environmental, social, and governance factors as they look at all types of investment, not just renewables, but encouraging them to apply those measures on renewable energy investment as well will help to identify potential human rights risks and put investors in a position to promote and encourage best practices by making better practices a condition of the loan, or creating preferential lending terms for companies that are meeting good practice standards. And we've seen that in the form of a recent investor briefing that came out on the human rights risks of renewable energy, and that was specifically geared toward investors, both project finance and more mainstream investors, who can use their investment leverage and their shareholder advocacy to ensure that these projects are going ahead responsibly, because that essentially reduces risks for investors, so it de-risks the project.
Without making it onerous, of course. I think the challenge sometimes with some investors is they get caught up in too much detail and not enough vision as well, my personal experience.
From my side, it depends on the stage of investment where you're coming in. So project finance is certainly different than an early stage bet or investment or in a startup. So one of the things that we're doing at FINCA is we're intervening at the firm level, at the startup level, and then at the end user level as well. And so a lot of folks have asked me, well, why are you making investments in these startups. And for us, it's a coordinating mechanism, right? As an investor, you become a partner, and in the best cases, I don't want to say a co-entrepreneur and give the investor too much credit, but in the relationship we have today, it has been very much about co-entrepreneuring the solution. They bring their expertise on the electrical engineering and the circuit development and the solar. Our energy partner brings their own expertise in energy hardware, and we bring our expertise in terms of what is actually working and what is needed. So you talk to folks, the first thing everyone says, everyone wants a TV. You actually start unpacking that, and like they want the TV for the restaurant so people stay longer, right? They want, we have had so many requests for, well, can I get a sewing machine? Like I really like a fridge. And so we go back to the company we're working with and say, where do we prioritize the water pump versus the DC powered fridge? And so coming back to your question, I think when you engage with organizations, I think on project finance it's certainly different. With us, it's we also don't know everything, and so as folks are interested in operating in this space and want to take that risk, come to the table and say, this is a problem we can help you solve for the company you're working with. Because again, I think to my mind, investing, it certainly is to monetize the value that you help create, but it's an incredibly efficient coordinating mechanism, at least, particularly at the early stages of businesses.
Agreed.
I have a question and a recommendation. So the question I have is, how are all your nonprofit organizations engaging the local people and providing them vocational training so that they can be part of the supply chain for the integration of the renewable energy in their communities, as opposed to bringing skilled labor from outside and doing projects? So I'm looking for ways in which we could do things more than just using their physical ability to carry weights from point A to point B, and that comes with vocational training. So that's the question. And then the recommendation is, for those EPCs who are doing wind projects, I would encourage them to approach the National Renewable Energy Lab here in Golden, Colorado, to understand how to optimally locate the wind turbines so that the wake of the wind turbine is not causing a drop in the power of turbines behind it. And that increases the concentration of turbines you can have in a certain area and get the maximum power out.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to express again that I'm a for-profit business, and we continue to gather the world together. And our largest partner is World Vision. They're the world's largest NGO by impact, 3.2 million children on a monthly basis. And they execute all of our programming, operating in 100 countries around the world, 60,000 some odd staff. And all of their local staff administer our training and spend time on the ground to substantiate the social impact, and it enlivens the entire country. And of course, it's education for the individual to share and spread the knowledge. And that's a critically important resource for us. It's not for us to just come in and implement a at-work program, but to educate people and to give them the hope. I've got this quote that I live by, and it reads, "We have the opportunity to choose who our children's parents will be. And we have to give everyone the opportunity to be in a position to choose, so they can inspire the next generation to also be in the action of making decisions that support themselves." Handouts diminish, we know that.
In terms of local...
Ami, quick question for Ami. I have some limited and somewhat frustrating experience with the type of finance you're engaged in.
Yeah.
And I heard you mention the word success, I think 3 times in one brief discussion you entered into. I'm curious, what metrics do you use to define success in this kind of financing? And is it measured by loan repayments? What are the metrics you're using?
That's a great question. So yes, I mean, I think, so to potentially confront what you're saying head on, like, so microfinance can be very expensive. One of the reasons that it is expensive, it is the cost of delivery. And we can happy to talk about that at length, offline. But it's not to grow margins. It is really to cover the cost of delivery. And in terms of success, so we have this conversation all the time, like what is the right rate of interest? And a simple measure of success for us is having folks come back to us and say, yes, like with your loan, I was able to grow my business. I was able to increase my income. I want another loan. A more complex method of success, measuring success is actually following longitudinal surveys and seeing how families actually are able to grow their assets. One of the things that we've been able to do over the last 10 years is actually transform credit institutions into deposit-taking institutions, so actually becoming more full-functioning banks and getting folks to actually start saving in individual accounts. Acknowledging that we work in communities that don't have the safety nets of OECD countries. How do we help them build those on their own? In doing that, also thinking about, there's a lot of innovation around microinsurance. We're certainly not going to be innovating that, but like figuring out who the right partners are on providing that to our customer base. So for me, success is sustainability to be able to fight another day, but ultimately success is actually helping folks progress out of poverty as quickly as possible. And I've gone kind of high level on that, and I appreciate that. So happy for you to follow up either now or later in terms of more particular metrics. But we very much measure repayment rates from a measure of sustainability, but it's also a signal that something's not right in that community if you have really high defaults. So it's not to say that we need to go more aggressively and follow up, but it's actually a symptom of a bigger malaise. And so it's a way for us to actually investigate and create extended terms for people to pay us back, because we're not in the business of being predatory lenders. We are in the business of helping people use productive capacity to find their way out of poverty. And one of the ways that folks talk about microfinance, or the way we talk about it, is you want to empower entrepreneurs. In the countries we operate in, I don't think we need as many entrepreneurs as we have. Folks actually just need good jobs. But like absent industrialization, you need something. And that something is the ability to actually find ways to use whatever latent productive capacity you have to earn some income. And hopefully over time, other folks are actually helping these countries build the industrialization that they need in order to transform folks from working hand to mouth to actually becoming employees, being able to earn pension, and all of the things that we, in building our middle class, took for granted.
Well, we're at time. Thank you so much, Soledad, Ami, and David. That concludes our panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.